This is an interview for the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales Oral History Project. The interviewee is Joe Catanzariti and I'm the interviewer, Judy Hughes. The date is the 10th of December 2021. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Judy.
Can we start with your early influences in life, where you're from and a bit about your family background?
Yes, if I can go, I suppose, way back, I consider myself to be extremely lucky that my father made a big decision, as many migrants did, to take a punt and come out on a boat from Italy after the Second World War. And as they all did, they had an idea that you'd come for a short period of time, make a few bucks and then go back. Now that never eventuated. He stayed in Australia. My mother followed him years later, and then I was born here. It's one of those things that I just keep reminding myself how lucky I am, the opportunities and the decisions made by coming to Australia. Truly it is the lucky country. Education was very significant in my life, and I think through education everything is possible.
But it wasn't an easy upbringing, was it?
No, the upbringing was far from easy. We were, in common parlance, extremely poor, right? I mean, my father was a shift worker. My mother was the traditional stay-at-home mother in those days. Shift work in that period is very different to the concept of shift work today. He worked a broken shift, so that meant that he'd go to work for 4 or 5 hours, come home for 4 or 5 hours and go back again, right? Now that just doesn't really happen now. So it's fair to say that there are very few times we would have a meal together at dinner because it just didn't happen. And so I'd see him basically during the weekend. So most of my time was spent with my mother, who was everything really. Had to carry the family because that's just the way it was. But you learn a lot from that, and you learn a lot. You learn to appreciate things. I mean, for me, I remember saying it. When he passed away, that getting chocolate biscuits created my sweet tooth really, because that was every payday. It was the luxury item, a packet of the Arnott's biscuits, and so you learn a lot of that. Also, I mean, the sort of schooling that I had, is very different to the schooling today because, even though Bondi Beach sounds a luxurious suburb today, when I grew up, it certainly was not that sort of area. It was quite a challenging environment. It was very white, to use that expression, and also not full of immigrants in those days. And I was certainly referred to in schooling as the WOG boy, right? Which I then translated later on to being the World Organisation of Geniuses as a joke, right? To sort of avoid that sort of attack, if you like. But it was a very interesting group of kids, really. I mean, from a lot of varied backgrounds, a lot of family issues. There certainly was no, in those years at the school, which was no longer exists, but it was Christian Brothers Bondi Beach. It was it was very, most people struggled, had families where they struggled. It brought a group of kids together that all had stories, certainly no affluence at all, right? And in fact, it was a school that in today's terms would end at year 10. It was expected that most people would not go on to year 11 and 12. And from my cohort, there were only about 3 or 4 that actually did. You had to change schools then. And they taught skills, which is also unusual when you think about it. In today's terms, you had a choice of going into an academic stream, or the alternate stream was tech, drawing and woodwork. Right now, everybody had to do woodwork in what is now year 7. And I remember, I'm not really a handyman, and I remember you had to make a box, and my box didn't look like anything like it, and it was just hilarious that I couldn't actually do things like that, and I really was quite academic, and that came very early on. It was clear that I was academically focused. But notwithstanding that, I think in that environment I learned a lot of life skills, right? And everybody was quite real. We all had the same sort of backgrounds, albeit that I came from a foreign background. You hear that expression in the old days where the Australian boy would have the Devon sandwich, we'd have the salami sandwich, we'd swap the sandwiches, right, the treat, because you weren't worried about all the things that happen now where you nut allergies and all the other things. Just didn't happen that way. Everybody shared and did that. There was a lot of what bullying in that school. I mean, and I was pretty nerdy, pretty small built, but you survived, right? You learned a lot about life, right? And it's ironic in one sense that I've done so much work in relation to workplace bullying, having experienced it firsthand, what it's like to be an outsider. And I would still consider myself, today pretty much an outsider. I don't really fit in the traditional way.
And what about your father? What sort of work did he do?
Well, my father had the glassworks at one period, then the buses, worked on the factory floor, even way back, right, even worked in the tobacco factory, right. But he held it together. I mean, you got to admire that. It was his uncle that persuaded him to come to Australia. He'd already been here. He had to leave a village in Italy, tiny village, which I have been back to. There's nothing in that village. I mean, it's very, and it's not a colourful village on the water or anything. It's in rocky areas, quite remote. Not much happens there. It's huge gamble to come to Australia, right? And the admiration never ceases, really, that he took that risk. And in those days, of course, it wasn't planes. It was like the 3-month boat trip.
And so what aspirations did he have for you in Australia?
Well, he was focused on one thing, I mean, education. Now, it's very interesting that both he and my mother were not educated, right? Effectively, if you look at an Australian equivalent, they would have been educated till about year 6, right? That's what the village was like. But his intelligence, and my mother's, is extraordinary. I mean, this is a guy that could, without any training, was reading the Sydney Morning Herald, into politics, into all that sort of stuff, but so unable to convert, right, in the sense that, because he wasn't educated in a traditional sense, but highly intelligent, right? We would have massive political discussions at the dinner table, right? It was, election nights were very exciting in our household, right? All those sort of things were happening from a background where he didn't have the normal education, but he was on top of all current affairs, right? So it was really exciting, right? I really miss election nights, and the first election night when he wasn't here anymore was very depressing, right? Because it was just that banter of having that debating the household, and all of that, when I think about it, makes me the person I am today. That was where it all came from. It's their heritage that really created that drive in me. I mean, he certainly never discouraged me. He encouraged me all the time, but without any pressure. It was not like you must do this, right? He was nurturing and encouraging me to sort of grow.
And you got to go to university.
Yeah, I mean, I was a product, if you like, of the Whitlam period. Gough Whitlam got elected in 1975. Free universities came in. That was my period, and it was. I mean, I'm forever grateful also to what happened under the Whitlam period. I mean, it really opened up education, right? I've always worked from 14, so I've never stopped working. And I'm, I was talking to somebody earlier today who said, when are you thinking retiring? I said, never, really. I mean, I don't want to retire, right? I just, I'm just in the mode of wanting to work, and I like working, and I started, packing groceries when I was 14, right? And even at that point, you learn so many things. I remember at age 15, working side by side with a worker who was much older than me, and then being hauled into HR and absolutely terrified and saying, well, have you observed what's been going on? And I said, no, what are you talking about? And right next to me, in those days it was cash. It was in one of the large stores, and this person was having multiple toilet breaks. And what I hadn't realised is that the person was actually taking the coins and shoving them in their clothes, right? And just learn all these things. Think, oh, that really happened. And of course, now in the world where I practice in employment law, right, nothing surprises me.
So what did you do when you first went to university? What did you study?
Well, when I went to university, it's a funny thing to fall into law and not into law. I mean, some people can say from the moment they're 5 or 6, law or whatever, teaching, whatever. Obviously, I had none of those influences. We had nobody in my family or extended family went to university before me. I was the first, right? So it's all big, right? I didn't make the decision till the high school certificate results came out, because my funny passion in one sense was chemistry. I was really into chemistry. At one stage I almost blew up the house in some of my experiments. I mean, again, you could get chemicals much easier then than you can today. So I created upstairs in my bedroom a laboratory effectively, right? So my intention was that, but the high school certificate results came out and I thought, you know, maybe you should convert some of the things you have been doing, because in my last 2 years I got heavily involved in debating, and then I twisted that around and thought, okay, I've got the marks, I'll enrol in law. And for a moment it was going to be science law. Then I was told, well, actually there's so much work in the science degree it's going to undervalue the law degree, so I switched very quickly and then went into arts law, right? And university for me, of course, was really, the first 6 months were incredibly difficult. Because of coming out of an Italian, Australian family. I'd never been out, right? In a sense, you know, I'd never gone out at night. Everything was sort of like, you know, a new Disneyland world, and people were so different to me, right? And law school, certainly in the mid 1970s, was very different, right? It's quite different to what it is today. I mean, there was a lack of diversity, right? Both in gender, in wealth, ethnic, the whole works was very different to what it is today, and quite confronting when people would say to me, you know, on day one of university, somebody said to me, so what did you do on your holidays? And I said, packing groceries. And they said they'd just come back from Aspen. There was a different world, right? So it wasn't a world I could relate to. But, you know, university was, after the first 6 months, I really got it together. The first 6 months, I'd say, terribly difficult. I didn't know whether I could cope in that environment, from, you know, the Catholic school environment where you're sort of looked after, to the big world. And it's a big world at university for somebody who doesn't have world experiences. There's no transition to university program. You're just thrown there. You've got to work out what you do. How do you study? I mean, it's all, you've got to direct yourself, right? There's no way. And I really didn't have anybody I could, as a mentor, anybody I could rely upon. So I just had to do my best, really.
And when did you become interested in industrial relations?
Well, that is pure chance. I mean, I'd like to say it was again planned, but it wasn't planned at all. I mean, in my first 6 months at university, I took the subject geography, which I had absolutely no knowledge really in, as one of the subjects. And then I ran into a guy ahead of me at school, and I said, I'm really hating this. And he said to me, why don't you just do industrial relations? I have a feeling you might like this. And frankly, the rest really is history, because I switched to industrial relations in the second half of year one, and it just clicked. It really clicked. Whether it was because I was surrounded by great teachers, all brand names. I remember, the very first class with Graham Dabschek, an absolute legend, telling us 1 in 3 is going to fail. Right? Sort of scares you, but the engagement by him and my tutors, and then being blessed by having the great John Nyland as one of the people who was teaching me, I just learnt a lot about, this is my passion, the world at work, right? That's the passion, and it really blossomed from there, and it also filtered right through into my law degree as I did all the subjects that were relevant to that. John Nyland gave me massive opportunities, gave me introduction to a number of work experiences. The very first one, I spent 3 months with the then Storeman and Packers Union, now National Union of Workers, during the major dispute they had involving Justice Staples and the Woolpackers, and that was really hands-on. Simon Crean was there, the late Bill Landahue. I was learning all this stuff. It's also the first time I'd left home to work in Melbourne. I didn't know how to do anything, frankly. I remember the very first time I had to wash my clothes. I didn't know you actually had to press a button on a washing machine. And certainly I didn't know how to cook or anything. But those 3 months, life-changing, working down in Melbourne. But it was just great. All of these memories are great because they make the person you ultimately are, and you got to thank those opportunities that John Nyland gave me.
So that was a work experience with which organisations?
So the National Union Workers first, then I had a stint with Qantas, and then East West Airlines, which no longer exists. So I spent all my summers at university working pretty much in industrial relations or work, right? So I didn't actually do any law in the traditional sense. So it was interesting when I finally had to get into law, right, at the end of it all. I remember that, because I hadn't participated in the summer clerk program, which is the entree to the law firms would say to me, well, you didn't do it, so I had to come in as a different level, right? And I remember one law firm said to me in their interview, well, you've worked for unions and you work for management. Do you really know who you are? And I said, no. So it's not a question of working for unions or management. I'm learning, right? To me, it's all about, and they said, the learning process for me, and I'm happy to sort of absorb and learn as much as possible. And it's not a question of ideology, it's a question of learning. And ultimately, I made my entire practice, if you like, as being non-ideological, right? Dealing with the case or the matter in front of me. As a lawyer, really, my view is that you should be telling the client not what they want to hear, but what they should be told. And a lot of lawyers still today don't do that. They really run the case because that's what the client wants to hear. I'd rather lose a client, and I did from time to time have arguments with clients, rather than put them down a path which I knew they would not win.
And so can you tell me a bit about your legal career then?
Yeah, my legal career began at what is now Kingwood and Mallisons. It was frenetic, if you like, 6 years. I mean, I had one lawyer there who was a couple of years ahead of me, Paddy Bergen. She was my mentor for a period, and Paddy went on to become the Chief Judge in the Equity Division of the Supreme Court of New South Wales. An extraordinary human being to be introduced to. And she just gave me encouragement. She didn't last in the solicitor side of the profession very long. She went quickly to the bar, became senior counsel, and the rest is history, right? So, but she introduced me to a lot of my labour law concepts that I learnt, right? And also the partner at the time there was Ross Wagland. So they were the starting point. It wasn't an industrial law practice like the other firms at the time were, like then Dawson Waldron. Those sort of firms had Free Hills, they had purest industrial relations practice. We had combined commercial litigation, a bit of industrial. After that period, I then spent the rest of my practicing career at Clayton Utz, quarter of a century, and set up the national practice there and created a very large practice. Sid Wong was one of the interviewers at the time for me going there, and he said, look, we don't really do this sort of stuff much, but if you want to give it a go for it. And I said, I want the challenge. So I was really keen to develop a practice and grow it as a national practice in workplace relations and employment law with a very strong philosophy of diversity and inclusion. So it was ahead of its time in one sense, in that those words are now used quite widely, but our practice was very much, non-ideological. We did pro bono work from the get-go, and on the commercial side, we were there, assisting management, but calling out bad behaviours when we saw them.
Can you tell me a bit about how your own background has influenced your views about diversity?
Well, I think in one sense I'm sort of laden with it in that while it may not have been conscious, right? Having as I said, from the beginning, always felt different, right? I mean, I just felt different. I mean, it was unusual. It's not unusual now to be, an Italian Australian, in that environment was really quite strange, right? And because there was, if you like, what is now viewed as being totally unacceptable behaviour, but in those times, the boys did what the boys did, right? So, you were bullied, you were berated, you were criticised, but you got to understand that, in fact, ultimately, diversity is strength. The more difference of views we have, the better we will be, right? And certainly I had, I had no issue with, the transition from university, from an all-male school to sort of the move to, diversity at large, right? It's part of my DNA, right? In my own life, I've had 3 daughters, and we don't talk about in the sense of that your world is based on a male world, not at all, right? Culturally, each of them from day one, right? It's about enhancing the individual and growing the individual, and I'm very proud of them that they fall within that. That's the learnings they've picked up from their father, right? Right, and we have to move away from saying you can't do. Everybody can do if they want to do. Everybody should be encouraged. Everybody should go for their own strengths, right? And everything is right because you do where your passion is, right? To me, passion is really important, right? So that if people go into a job, and I've seen this in my own life many times where people do law, for example, because their parents said do law, right? Or do medicine or whatever, and they're not happy because they don't have the passion for what they're doing. To me, it's all about making a difference. Why am I doing what I'm doing now, right? It's still because you want to make a difference. But if your driver is something else, it just doesn't work for you. And it's all linked to sort of being passionate about what you do. You hear these experts who talk about getting your mojo and all these other language and all that. Those motivational speakers. I'm not into that sort of zone, but I'm saying enhance your individuality and do what you want to do, and there are no barriers, right? And that's really what it's about. And so, I really believe in this. I don't mouth the words. I would say to my young solicitors, if you're racist, if you're sexist, if you're homophobic, really it's going to be difficult working with me because they're not the prisms I work through. And if you pretend because you think you've got to say the right thing, it'll come through. You've got to genuinely accept people for who they are. Right? And that will make you, ultimately, it's a much better place to be.
And can you tell me a bit about your time with the Society, how you joined, what sort of leadership positions you held, what you wanted to see the Society do?
Well, I've again, probably influenced by John Nyland, I got involved in the Industrial Relations Society very early on. Right now, I've in the Society of New South Wales, I spent around 30 years on the executive, right? 2 times as president, and also as the national secretary for about 11 years, right? Also, right? I had a great time, and I would certainly, at university, John encouraged the students to get involved in the IRS, right? He was pretty direct about it. It was a good thing for you to do. And actually, it's a great thing for you to do, right? Because when I think about the IRS over the years and the things that I've got out of it, I mean, right from a very simple thing where when I became quite senior in my profession, I met a young uni student at one of the IRS functions. And this guy, I said to him, look, I'm looking for a paralegal. You're in law. You're a law student. Would you like to work for us, right? And just because I just met him and that session, and he said, yeah, fine, right? Go forward many years later, this guy is now a senior counsel, Yassine Sharif, right? It makes me so proud to have mentored somebody like that and seen people grow, and that I continually do that with my current associates in this new job, etc. And a lot of these people have, at an early stage, got involved with the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales, which is very active, and the annual conferences are memorable, right? I mean, in the 1970s, 80s, colourful to say the least, right? We had legendary people in those conferences, right? We had legendary events. We had the train trips to Bathurst on one conferences. We had conferences in Terrigal. We had unions singing Solidarity Forever, right? You learn so much by dealing with people who sometimes will be your adversary, really. But you get them in an environment where it's healthy debate on issues, and you're just building up a long-term connection with these people. And spanning now quite a long time, a lot of the people I met way back as a student, I'm still in touch with, many years later. So the IRS provides that connection If you just want to, if you want to make it that, I mean, it's not a connection to get your job. It's a connection of learning, right? It's great learning, and you're learning from a lot of people. And I've been lucky to have also, in the executive role, work with a number of the editors of the journal, which is another significant part of the IRS. So I started with John Nyland, but then I had Graham Dabschik, and then Russell Lansbury, then Braden Ellum and Marion Baird. So that cycle of editors, right? And in the last few of those, working on the actual contractual stuff of the journal as the journal reinvigorated itself with its change of publishers and other things. And you just get to have a whole perspective of the significance of the journal in itself, which is now a leading journal in academic circles. And that itself was a hard task for the editors to turn it from just a journal to be something that people want to write into that journal because they get academic credentialing in their own careers. So that also was great.
And what did you try to bring to the Society in your leadership positions?
Well, I mean, certainly there are a number of things I was looking to. One was growing membership, right? So that the word industrial relations, which we still keep, of course, turns some people off, right? Because they think of it as an old term. Now, we're all into, human resources language, workplace relations, etc. In the international body, they changed their title to labour and employment relations to sort of change the breadth, right? And universities, of course, have changed their titles as well. So, in one sense, the language has changed, but the philosophy is the same, right? So, the remit of, if you like, education, dialogue, diversity, these are all the things that we focused on in my entire time with the Society. And the Society really didn't have from the get-go really didn't have those sort of problems, right? Because people were continually encouraging people, and it was a very inclusive. Unlike other bodies, right? We actually embrace all. So we have academics, we have the judiciary, we have unions, we have management, right? Everybody's there. Whereas a lot of the organisations say, this is management focused only. This is only for unions, right? Now that doesn't allow the beauty of the entire universe to come together, right? And there would be heated debates, friendly debates, but heated at conferences where people would be fighting over issues. You'd have politicians making signature statements at some of our conferences, right? And during election cycles, politicians would love to try to get a spot on one of the IR conferences. So all of that was very healthy, and it's the journey continues. Now, I also believe in generational change, right? Rebuilding all the time. So, there came a point when I decided that it was time that I should get off the executive, right? Not that I'm not interested in the Society, not at all, but it's to take time out, right? And allow further generational change all the time and allow more people with more ideas coming through. And I think in any organisation you need to have that sort of continual rebirthing, right? And the IRS continually does that, rather than have people that just hang around forever. Right? Now, obviously, over time, there were massive fights on various issues, right? I mean, there were fights over the direction of the Society at times, right? I remember those debates about, where should we go, and, is the inclusive nature the right thing? Some people had a view that, there are other organisations emerging, and of course, the money was in the management side, but we're not about the money, right? It's about what are we providing? What is the value proposition? And the IRS value proposition is, it's a core value proposition of wide-ranging education to its members and the dialogue. And over the years, they've done a lot more stuff in the practical side too. They're doing a whole lot of, shorter seminars, shorter learnings, emerging issues, right? And everybody's doing it gratuitously, right? Right. Everybody's giving their time, right? So that's really good to see.
And can you just talk briefly about your time at the Commission? What made you decide to go from your legal career to the Commission?
Yeah, well, it's a whole lot of things that coalesced, if you like. I mean, I had been the president of the Law Society of New South Wales and then the president of the Law Council of Australia. When you move into those very senior leadership positions, you are at the forefront of a whole lot of policy and a whole lot of issues and shaping stuff really. And it was almost the case really that I didn't think mentally that I could just become a practitioner again after those roles, right? And hoping that I was going to do something different, particularly after the Law Council president was going to come to an end, because at that stage I'd been, shooting the breeze with ministers left, right, and centre, talking about policies. You get to a stage where you say, well, what can you do to make a difference, given that I'm not a politician? Where else can I assist the community? Right now, I believe practicing lawyers should always be giving back anyway, right? So at some point they should give back that which they have deserved and taken in one sense. They've been given a lot of opportunities. Now they should always be giving back. And when this opportunity came up to join the Commission as one of the Vice Presidents, there was really no hesitation. Whether the timing was right or wrong doesn't really matter. You can't control the timing. But there was new legislation, new opportunities, and I thought, well, this is where I can make a significant difference, and hopefully that's what I've been doing over the last 8 years, and the respect that I have for the institution is great. So I was going into an organisation with a long history, full of some extraordinary people over many years, and here was an opportunity to make a small contribution.
That's great. Just sort of finally, because we're at the end of our time, can you say why you think young people should consider a career in industrial relations?
Well, fundamentally, everybody works, right, in one sense, right? Working is part of our ethos, right? Now, in industrial relations, and you can define industrial relations many ways. Let's say it's dealing with people and helping people, right? So in industrial relations, you are there as an agent to help people, right? Whether it be a dispute at work, whether it be, an issue involving the workplace as a whole, right? We used to say when I first started practice in this area that I'm not a lawyer, right? That's what they would say that about me, those that criticise what I was doing, right? Because we're not really a lawyer, because we know what lawyers are. They're commercial litigators, they're property lawyers, etc. But you industrial relations people, you're in the grey zone. You're too grey. Well, you know what? Being in the grey zone is what I would encourage people to do industrial relations in, because we are in the grey zone, even today, right? We are actually trying to achieve, we're trying to mediate, we're trying to resolve, we're trying to assist, we're trying to make a difference in the workplace. And that's not a bad place to spend your whole working life, to assist others. And as a young person, going industrial relations can be very exciting and lead to other things. You might ultimately, some of the great industrial relations people can even be chief executives if they wanted to, right? And they have been, right? But it's that dealing with people you'll only get in that true sense by being in the industrial relations.
That's great. Is there anything you'd like to talk about that we haven't touched on today?
Just thinking through, I mentioned the journal, I've mentioned some of the great leaders, the education focus.
Maybe emerging issues. There are certainly some new diversity issues in the workplace now.
Yes, well, I think, I wasn't thinking really that. First thing I thought of when you said emerging was I went straight for the gig economy as being an emerging issue. Yes. And a lot of debate we're seeing in the industrial relations societies about, they're talking about how do we deal with the gig economy, right? Because work continually changes. On diversity, we've got other emerging diverse issues untapped. For example, the Asianisation of Australia and the large number of Asian Australians are underrepresented in leadership roles generally, right? Now, I vividly remember, well, I don't really remember this, but I remember the 40-year mark, not the early mark. So I don't remember 1972 vividly, when Gough Whitlam got rid of the White Australia policy. I do remember growing up as a child, all the ads about Reds under the beds, right? So this whole idea that, it was not appropriate to have Asians in Australia. And you could walk down some cities in Australia where there was invisibility in terms of Asians. That's not the case today. And 40 years later, when we celebrated, as I was President-elect of the Law Council with the Prime Minister, celebrating, the change of the world in Australia, right? But yet, when we come to representation of that group in leadership roles, it's way underdone, right? And, ironically, when I joined Clayton Utes, I know this I actually looked at, prior to making the decision, the partnership profile, right? And there are a couple of things that really stood out at that time, and this is 1988, right? And we're talking about even 1988, so that's not that long ago, right? I was comparing it with a large number of the other firms, and the two of the criteria I was looking at were women and people of a different ethnic background, right? I was consciously doing that. And in 1988, a large number of the large firms, which today have a large number of women in leadership roles, did not, right? They just didn't, right? And it was just, yet Clayton Utes had, certainly, even at that time, a large number of women in those leadership roles. And in fact, I met some women at Clayton Utes subsequently who had left their previous large firms to come to Clayton Utes because those large firms had not yet embraced promoting women, right? Right. It was quite strange, and there was comments about pregnancy equaling retirement, right? And even in law, which was strange, right? I mean, we knew that, in flight attendants and things like that, there was discrimination. If you were 35, that was it, right? The other thing that Clayton Utes had, which I could not find anywhere in the large firms at that stage, was a partner with an Asian background, right? And that was extraordinary. He was, in one sense, older than me, but no different to me. He had a history of migration, coming to us, studying in Australia, the whole works, right? And I thought, well, that's really the sort of organisation that you can see understands by its actions that diversity really matters. And throughout my entire time there, right, they live those values.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.